In 1989, Poland was so broke it could barely import basic medicines. Inflation peaked at over 600% that year. Store shelves stood empty in most major cities, and the average Polish worker earned somewhere around $50 a month. The country was carrying foreign debt it had no realistic way of repaying. The currency was effectively worthless on international markets, and a generation of Poles had grown up in a system that was, by almost every measurable standard, broken. By any reasonable assessment, Poland in 1989 was not a developing economy, it was a collapsing one. And yet, in 2024, Poland's GDP per capita on a purchasing power basis officially overtook the United Kingdom's. Just 35 years earlier, the UK was nearly 20 times richer than Poland in nominal terms. Today, when adjusted for what people can actually buy with their money, the average Pole has roughly the same standard of living as the average Briton. Poland's economy has grown without a single year of recession since 1992, an unbroken run of over 3 decades that no other country in the European Union has matched. GDP has expanded more than 7-fold in that time. Warsaw is now home to the tallest skyscraper in the European Union. The Polish Stock Exchange has overtaken Vienna's as the largest in the region. And German manufacturers increasingly describe Polish industrial regions not as cheap labor markets, but as core parts of their supply chains. For a country that started the 1990s as one of Europe's poorest economies, this is a genuinely remarkable transformation. But it raises an obvious question. How did a country sitting between a collapsing Soviet Union and a recently reunified Germany manage to outpace the country that built the modern industrial world? And just as importantly, is Poland's rise actually as solid as the headlines suggest, or is the next decade going to be much harder than the last one? To understand how Poland got here, it helps to understand what the country inherited when communism ended. The economy was dominated by enormous, inefficient, state-owned enterprises producing goods that no one outside the Eastern Bloc actually wanted to buy. Heavy industry was concentrated in coal, steel, and shipbuilding, sectors that were already in structural decline across the developed world. Productivity was a fraction of Western European levels, in some sectors as low as a quarter. The Warsaw Pact trading system, which had absorbed most Polish exports, was disintegrating in real time. And on top of all this, the country was carrying around $40 billion of foreign debt, a figure that today sounds modest, but at the time represented several years of Polish national output and was almost universally considered unrepayable. In January 1990, just months after the first partially free elections, Poland's new government did something almost no other post-communist country was willing to do at the same speed. Finance Minister Leszek Balcerowicz introduced what became known as the Balcerowicz Plan, a sweeping package of reforms that lifted price controls overnight, cut state subsidies, opened the country to international trade, and made the Polish złoty convertible. Western economists at the time called it shock therapy, and the early results were brutal. GDP fell sharply, by some estimates over 10% in the first 2 years. Unemployment surged from essentially zero under communism to over 16%. Entire industrial towns built around a single state factory faced economic collapse. For roughly 2 years, the pain was severe enough that many observers expected the entire experiment to fail politically. It did not fail, and the reasons matter. By forcing the adjustment to happen quickly, Poland compressed a decade of restructuring into a few years. By 1992, the economy was growing again. By 1995, it was growing faster than any major economy in Europe. The countries that took a more gradual approach, including Ukraine and parts of the former Soviet Union, ended up trapped in a much longer and deeper transition, in some cases lasting well into the 2000s. Poland's willingness to take the pain early bought it a head start that compounded for the next 30 years. It is one of the rare cases in modern economic history where short-term political courage has produced exactly the long-term outcome the textbooks predicted, but shock therapy alone does not explain a 30-year boom. The second engine, and arguably the more important one, was Europe. In 2004, Poland joined the European Union along with 9 other countries in the largest single expansion in EU history. For Poland, accession did 3 things at once. It locked the country into a stable institutional and legal framework, which made it dramatically less risky for foreign companies to invest. It opened tariff-free access to a single market of roughly 450 million consumers, suddenly giving Polish producers the same trading rights as German or French ones, and it unlocked enormous transfers from the EU budget, money explicitly designed to help poorer member states catch up. Those transfers were not small. Since joining the EU, Poland has received over 240 billion euros in net structural and cohesion funds, more than any other member state in absolute terms. That money paid for highways, railways, water treatment, modernized universities, and tens of thousands of smaller infrastructure projects. The visible result is that traveling across Poland today, particularly between major cities, feels closer to traveling across Germany than across most of the rest of Central Europe. The less visible result is that this infrastructure made Poland a far more attractive place to build a factory, run a logistics hub, or operate a back office. Foreign companies noticed. Between 2004 and the mid-2020s, Poland attracted around 350 billion euros in foreign direct investment, a number that places it among the top destinations for FDI anywhere in Europe. Much of that investment came from Germany, and this is where the relationship becomes especially important. As German manufacturers, particularly in the automotive sector, came under pressure from rising domestic costs and an aging workforce, they did not move production to Asia. They moved it eastward, often just across the Polish border. Today, Polish factories produce engines, transmissions, electronics, and components that are then assembled into cars sold under German brand names. Roughly 1 in 5 Polish manufacturing jobs is now linked, directly or indirectly, to German industry. This integration created a powerful flywheel. Foreign investment brought capital, technology, and management practices. The cohesion funds built the infrastructure that supported that investment. The single market gave Polish products somewhere to go, and a young, well-educated, and relatively low-cost workforce did the actual work. Poland combined these ingredients more effectively than almost any other post-communist country, and the results compounded year after year. The numbers tell the story. Between 1995 and 2024, Polish GDP per capita rose from roughly 30% of the EU average to over 80%. The middle class expanded from a small minority into the majority of households. Polish exports diversified from coal and ships into machinery, electronics, vehicles, and services. Unemployment, which exceeded 20% in the early 2000s, fell to around 3% by the mid-2020s, one of the lowest rates in the entire developed world. Wages, although still below Western European levels in nominal terms, have been rising at 4 to 6% a year in real terms for most of the last decade. Reconstruction and convergence, however, do not explain everything. Plenty of Eastern European countries joined the EU in 2004 or shortly afterwards. Hungary, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and the Baltic states all received access to the same single market and broadly similar funding. Yet over the past 2 decades, Poland has steadily pulled ahead of most of them in absolute economic size and, more recently, in living standards as well. The difference comes down to a few specific choices. Poland kept its own currency, the zloty, rather than adopting the euro, which gave it monetary flexibility during the 2008 financial crisis that euro members did not have. While the rest of Europe slid into recession in 2009, Poland was the only EU economy to grow, partly because a weaker zloty made Polish exports more competitive at exactly the moment Western European demand was collapsing. Poland also has something its smaller neighbors do not: a domestic market of nearly 38 million people, large enough to sustain serious local industries that do not depend entirely on exports, and Polish governments, despite frequent political turbulence, have generally maintained a remarkably consistent approach to economic policy across changes in administration, particularly on questions of trade openness and foreign investment, yet none of this stanta means Poland's rise is guaranteed to continue. In fact, several of the engines that powered the last 30 years are starting to slow at the same time, and this is the part of the story that rarely makes the headlines. The first vulnerability is demographic. Poland's fertility rate has fallen to around 1.16 children per woman, one of the lowest in Europe and well below the replacement level of roughly 2.1. The country has also been a net exporter of working-age people for 2 decades. After EU accession, an estimated 2 to 3 million Poles emigrated, mostly to the United Kingdom, Germany, and Ireland. Some have returned, but many have not. The result is that Poland's working-age population is now shrinking and is projected to fall by several million over the next 2 decades. A growth model built on a young, expanding workforce becomes much harder to sustain when that workforce is contracting. The arrival of over 1 million Ukrainian refugees since 2022 has provided a partial buffer, but it is unclear how many will remain in the long term. The second vulnerability is structural. Poland's economy is heavily dependent on Germany, which absorbs nearly 30% of Polish exports. When German industry does well, Poland does well, but Germany itself has been struggling. Its automotive sector is being reshaped by the transition to electric vehicles. Its energy-intensive industries are dealing with permanently higher power prices since the 2022 energy crisis, and its overall growth has stagnated. If Germany enters a long period of weak growth, Poland's export engine loses its main customer. The relationship that made Poland rich is also a concentration risk that the country has only recently begun to take seriously. The third vulnerability is what economists call the middle-income trap. Countries growing from poor to middle income often grow quickly because they can adopt existing technologies, attract foreign investment, and move workers from low-productivity agriculture into higher productivity manufacturing. But getting from middle income to genuinely rich is much harder. It requires producing things the rest of the world wants to buy because they are uniquely good, not just cheaper. It requires building local research, design, and brand value, not just assembling components for someone else. Poland's economy is still heavily weighted toward being a supplier within other countries' value chains, particularly Germany's. Its share of high-value research and development spending, although rising, remains below the EU average. Polish brands that compete globally on quality in the way that German engineering brands or Italian fashion brands do are still relatively rare. Compared with its actual peers, however, Poland's position looks much stronger than it might from inside. Hungary has broadly similar demographics and faces broadly similar export dependence, but its institutions have drifted in ways that have made it harder to attract long-term investment, and its growth has slowed accordingly. The Czech Republic remains wealthier per capita and has a more sophisticated industrial base, but its smaller domestic market gives it less room to maneuver. Slovakia became deeply specialized in car assembly, which made it vulnerable when that single sector came under pressure. Poland has so far avoided putting all of its weight on any one industry, region, or partner, even if Germany comes uncomfortably close to being exactly that. There is also a more recent factor that very few analyses captured even 5 years ago. Since Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, Poland has become one of the most strategically important countries in NATO. It now spends over 4% of its GDP on defense, the highest share in the alliance, and has been on a sustained military buying spree, ordering tanks, fighter aircraft, artillery, and air defense systems on a scale not seen in Europe since the Cold War. Some of that spending flows to American and South Korean suppliers, but a meaningful share is being directed into rebuilding Poland's own defense industry. Combined with EU and national programs to reshore strategic production, this has the potential to give Poland a new pillar of high-value manufacturing at exactly the moment it needs one. Whether this becomes a genuine industrial transformation or simply a temporary spending boom will depend on choices being made right now. This is why the current moment matters. Poland is no longer a poor country trying to catch up. It is a mid-sized European economy with reasonable institutions, a serious manufacturing base, and a strategic position that has rarely been more important. But it is also reaching the point where the easy growth is over. The cohesion funds will eventually taper as Poland becomes too wealthy to qualify for the largest transfers. The population is getting older. The model of being Germany's lower-cost industrial partner only works for as long as Germany itself remains the center of European manufacturing, and as long as Polish wages stay meaningfully below German ones, both of which are slowly becoming less true every year. So is Poland really the next Germany? Probably not, and certainly not in the next decade. Germany became wealthy through a century of accumulated industrial expertise, globally recognized brands, deep capital markets, and a position at the center of European trade that was never really matched anywhere else. Poland has built something different and in many ways more interesting. It has shown that a country starting from genuine collapse, with no oil, no colonial wealth, and no obvious geographic advantage, can within a single generation reach roughly the same standard of living as one of the world's oldest industrial powers. That is not a small achievement. It is, in fact, one of the most successful economic transformations in modern European history. What Poland looks like in 2040 will depend on whether it can do the harder thing next. It will need to keep more of its people, attract higher value investment, build domestic brands and technologies, and find new markets to balance its dependence on Germany. None of these are easy. Some of them may not happen, but the country that, in 1989, could not afford basic medicines now has options that were unimaginable then. From around $50 a month to overtaking the United Kingdom on living standards in a single working life is a story most economies cannot tell. Whatever happens next, that part is already real.